I graduated from a BA in Fine Art at the University of Leeds in 2016 and a Master's in Gallery Museum Studies in 2018, which I did as part of a traineeship funded by the Royal Armouries and Leeds Museums and Galleries. Between 2016 and March this year, I was working both part-time and full-time in the museum sector, and also continuing to develop and exhibit my work in artist-led spaces and institutions, and only going full-time artist a couple of months ago. The image that I've got on the screen right now is from my last exhibition, which was on display at Jerwood Arts, called Passing of the Lilies, as part of Jerwood solo presentations earlier this year. And thinking about the theme of tension void, I was interested in trying to research what those terms might mean in relation to the work I make, but also their relationship to Hepworth. But what I ended up researching and writing was the relationship of void to artefacts and objects which we display and value, and how the themes of void might frame the core of my material practice. I hope this might be interesting somewhat, but this is also a compoundment of some of the research that I undertook and somehow trying to articulate it. So apologies if it doesn't make very much sense, but hopefully it's interesting. But before I kind of get into that, I thought it might be useful for me to situate some of my practice beforehand. So my practice is mainly sculpture and large-scale installation, which is embedded within 3 strands of research. The first strand is exploring the complexities and issues around the Western Museum, specifically focusing on the display of artefacts engaged by these museums, how objects from the Middle East particularly are displayed, and what Western displays tell us about those objects. I'm interested in what happens to these objects which have been historically stolen and severed from their homes, and whether they come to the museums to die and be displayed in a purpose-built graveyard, but also what happens to the landscape from which they were amputated, and the different hierarchies of value and power which they inherit through display and interpretation through Western museum practice. So pictured was the Lamassu at the British Museum, and this is the Ishtar Gate at the Pergamon in Berlin. Recently, my work sort of shifted to consider and research the practice of excavation, particularly looking at archaeological procedures and the historiography of archaeological practices, their reasons, and also their processes of extraction, object-orientated navigation, and the invention of histories presented as truths when objects excavated are presented in museums. The other strand of my practice is defined by my own experience of identity, being Iraqi but growing up in Scotland, and navigating an understanding of heritage with that dual identity, how to place displacement through diaspora, and how much of my experience of my heritage has been through oral histories told by family, which then almost becomes an inherited nostalgia, which conjures up tangible connections to a land never visited, and how important that is in terms of navigating identity, how that begins to form a bodily relationship and courses through you like blood. This for me sort of came through the discovery of like the ancient Near East through going to see that in museums, and I think it was like 2015 when I went to the British Museum, and I was like, oh my god, wow, these are my ancestors, hi. But then sort of becoming obsessed with this history, which has always been talked about as the cradle of civilization, but actually we've never really been taught anything in schools about it. And I guess for me, like my kind of beginning of exploration was wanting to replicate the forms that I was seeing in museum collections at that time. So the third strand of the work is materiality and the importance of play and texture within the practice. As much of my work like manifests in large-scale installation, it's also quite kind of constantly enmeshed with smaller and more considered objects such as vessels. In making the practice a landscape which seeks to question or converse the theories and practices of Western museology, but also the complex ravine of identity placement. And I guess there is sort of where elements of the materials start to converse with one another. The materials that I've been drawn to using have been polystyrene, clay, plaster and metal, partially starting to use them for ease and cheapness, but also to draw on the ways in which theatre sets are built, basing a lot of the decor on polystyrene clad and resin or other materials that create an environment which for a second is seen as real and true. Working with these methods of making and the process of enrobing materials such as polystyrene and plaster, which in turn creates for what for a split second is a rock or a mass or something that relates us back to the natural world or unlocks a memory. Similarly with the clay work, which is air-dry clay, which is dressed with a copper leaf, which is then oxidized to create a verdigris patina. These objects, which are lumpen and humble, almost become ancient artifacts, objects that imbue through colouring and the manipulation of form a history that is not theirs at all. I think it's in this moment of trickery that the practice becomes possibly a question of how we visualize the past, how we as humans are constantly in search for touch that places us in the seams of historical understanding, and how objects are often those vesicles which embody that burden. And being invited to this symposium to reflect on themes of tension void, I looked up the dictionary definition of void and it came back with these descriptions. 1, to have no legal force or effect, not legally binding or enforceable. 2, useless, ineffectual, vain. 3, an empty space, emptiness. 4, something experienced as loss or privation. 5, to make ineffectual, invalidate, nullify. 6, to empty, discharge, evacuate. I started to think about how the sculptures in one sense literally exist and are created to be a void. I started to think about the correlation between the forged, the mimicked, the false and the fake, which creates a presence of absence through the object which was never meant to exist, here being the sculpture. I started to think about how the sculptures in one sense literally exist and are created to be a void. And yeah, like at the same time, relating this idea of void to the praxis of excavation, thinking about the definition of emptiness, and how objects which are excavated and extracted from these archaeological sites may conversely be described as voids due to their inability to tell us the narrative of social history outside of the material that they contain, unlike the landscape that they are gleaned from. Perhaps my interest with void is how the diasporic body might exist as a void, and in my case, to create an exploratory constellation of void through sculpture, which then necessitates and reinfers void through its material substance. In some way, I was thinking about it as a void making a void, which questions the void itself. I don't know. But I also wonder if this creates a bigger void or whether the process of making actually fills one. Through the process of musealization, especially in the West, we tend to think or not think about the landscape of those objects at all as near as ripe as the object itself. In some senses, the landscape becomes the void. In the same way, the process of extraction of objects may nullify them outside of their context. The archaeologist Laurent Olivier speaks about the process of voidance and ruin with the vestige. In his book, The Dark Abyss of Time, he writes, material creations, objects, sites, landscapes, die when they cease undergoing change, and then our memory of them dies. As the material continuation of the past is handed down, it is necessarily altered. Any history that posits the past is different from the present, that is incomprehensible outside of the specific context of its time, is meaningless. It destroys the past. I found this really interesting. By interpreting a history or trying to formalize it, perhaps through an archaeological survey or through a sculpture, that the object will consistently be defunct. In this thought, it could be argued that these sculptures possibly exist as a proxy or for a deficit through the process of literal casting on one hand, and secondly, the form which it takes by being a replica of a memory which is void too. Thinking about the process of sculpting, it seems to also fall into a cycle of reconstituting. Plaster is gypsum stone shredded into dust, which is then reformed as a new stone through the addition of water. And its process, when used in sculpting, then bears the literal handforms and handprints of gesture through its use. Despite it now being altered to embody the bodily memory of the maker, its literal materiality is void. It can emulate environments with ease, similarly to how polystyrene in its ability to be formed, imposed, and supposed. These materials can take the form of emptiness, that space of unknown and unbendable languages then exist. Everything about these materials is designed to destruct in some senses, even through the terminology associated with them. For example, to ossify, to calcify, to solidify, to entropy, macerate, permeate, porate. When these terms are used to describe geographies and landscapes, they are used as literal terms of geographical renewal, the process of changing materiality from one state to another. It's really interesting when we consider these in relation to the body, when mummies are found in bogs, or the processes of decay in the human form following death. These terms are never about renewal in the same way as they are for geographies. Instead, they are presented as finite, the end of life cycle, the void. Going back to this process of imbuing memory through sculptural material, how then do these terminologies begin to develop? Sculpture is arguably the space which is caught between geography and the body, and to rethink the ideas of material reconstitution, the void again becomes present, despite the use of the body to imprint memory onto these fake stones and mimicked artifacts. The body is arguably one of the only true vestige of relationship to our enmeshment with the archaeological past. Its ability to hold or be a slit for the dreams and gestures of past lives are the stories which grow from our DNA structures and live in the subconscious. They flex and they wither over time. Memories of ancestors are carried through the pushing and pulsing of blood and spittle in our bodily vessels. One literal example of this is how grandmothers can carry 3 generations of eggs in their genetic makeup, meaning that my grandmother would have carried the exact number of eggs which my mother had, and that I now carry and shed every month. Some touch is known without its knowledge, like how our tongue can tell the texture of the world around it without ever having tasted it. From conversations with peers, we who exist within a diasporic identity are felt as perforations in an ancestry, a flesh which carries voidance. To counteract, many of us form material gestures which try to counter emptiness, making new stones and vessels to evoke what is indecipherably lost, and form new crevices where our backs can fit, a place of new geography that holds the amputated but corporeal traditions of the past that make sense for us. Perhaps it's emulating the past through imagined landscapes and world building, which manifest in stones, moss, and the texture of time, creates a space of pointed hand-holding, the moment of metamorphosis of the whole into a home. How then they use these ideas around the death of memory, / the inability to store these flesh languages, and physical weights that sift through the spaces between our fingers as we wash our faces with water. This is the moment of forging, where it begins the resonance of imagination, putting the muscle and heartbeat of the oral untouchable into a place, which sometimes is the effigy. I wanted to bring these ideas of void back to thinking around archaeological vestige and the processes of extraction and memory which that contains. I wanted to read a bit of a text from a film I made called Capture, which I made during a residency at Triangle Asteroides in Marseille earlier this year. The vestige in a museological sense means 1, a trace or remnant of something that is disappearing or no longer exists. In the biological sense, vestige means 2, a part or organ of an organism which has become reduced or functionless in the course of evolution. The vestige is always a ruin or something in the process of ruination. In the museum, we see vestiges held, taught, and captive in a process which removes them from their further deterioration. We witness them in the split between living and dying, between their absence and their presence. They are understood as places which hold memory. They are preserved in the moment in which they were beginning the process of disappearing. The process of taking objects from landscape is mysterious, and their journey to display as we know them is rarely referenced. They go through stages of process: burial, excavation, extraction, removal, fragmentation, identification, association, verification, assimilation, classification, hierarchization. Some get put to work, some get put to sleep, some make it to display. Outside of the ground, these shards are now seen as precious materials, stars. It is easy to forget about the archaeological landscapes they came from. How these sites are also imbued with the memory and tangibility of a past, and the blossoming of presents and futures. How land can also exist as ghosts. The emptiness of gesture, the compression of layered memories which are so thinly spread, they have the consistency of a web catching light, almost not existing, almost empty, forging a void. How can these explorations of void, emptiness, and loss be found in the patinate of a badly moulded Jesmonite ram? The poet Gustave Saubin asks us whether memory is any different than existing in these negative void spaces. He says, aren't we continually running over the imprint, the deeply fissured outlines of vanished experience, attempting to read it, solidifying it as facets of understanding the past? I guess this presentation is trying to think about the ways in which the void is important to the process of sculpture and play, how the work exists as a void, spaces which occupy and emulate the presentation of dead stone bodies, memory as a void as a poem, absence as a return, something within the film of muscle that our bodies inhabit, the last physical market of our natural geographies, is broken down and disseminated into a vessel, a colour. As collectors of preciousness, how are we then drawn through the orientation and recognizability of bronze which has verdigraded? How and why is this process of ossification to land found material culture constitute the deep desire of capture and ownership? Perhaps, as Saubin says, our attraction to it speaks to that dark abyss of void and memory and tradition, which we are so desperately wanting to hold and engage, as though we are trying to weave a basket out of a shadow. Thank you very much for listening.